Hey, and we are on Facebook. So here we are. Welcome everyone to History Matters, and so does coffee. Um, Today we're going to talk about the rule of law, which sounds really boring, but it won't be, I promise. But before we do that, I turn to my wonderful partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody, and happy summer to the teachers joining us who now don't have to rush to class and can not have to watch this through the archives. But we welcome everybody here, history lovers of all ages, all walks of life. Summer is here. We're excited to have you. The way this works is Joanne's going to talk about today's topic, the rule of law, for about 30 minutes. You can engage in the chat as you've already been doing. And in about 30 minutes, I'll come back and look in the Q&A. So if you have questions specific to today's topic, please add those in the Q&A, and then we'll get to those at about 30 minutes. See you then.
Okay. And as I always say, or mean to always say and occasionally forget, if you are new, if this is your first time or second time, if you're relatively new to History Matters, please tell folks in chat. This is our 219th episode, and I only needed to be told that twice within 1 minute to actually have it penetrate my brain. Don't know why it never does, but at any rate, we have an amazing community that's built up over those 219 episodes. So if you're here for the first time or second time, just say so in chat and you will get a robust welcome. Okay, now, the rule of law. So, I was, as ever, on a Thursday, pondering what I wanted to talk about. And since we're at episode 219, I'd say, I don't know, maybe how many recent episodes, a good number of them. We are now at the point, we've done so many episodes that I'll think of a topic and then I'll immediately think, have we done that? We talked about that before, and then I have to go looking, and sometimes it's easy to tell because of the title. Sometimes it's not easy to tell. This was one that was both easy and not easy to tell, that in one way or another, I've addressed this before for good reason, because it's important, although I'm going to talk about it in a different kind of a way today. So I did go, there was one previous episode about the rule of law. I didn't write down the title, but it is very clearly about the rule of law. And it's from last year. And interestingly, we were talking about the rule of law because what was in the news, what was being debated, was when Donald Trump's trial should be and its impact on the rule of law. So in a way, that episode was about the strength of the rule of law, the importance of the rule of law, the ways in which we need to think about the rule of law, how we might not be thinking about it in a lot of ways. What I'm going to be emphasizing today, now that we've had the trial and the outcome, is the fragility of the rule of law, which is perfectly logical. But the sort of up and down of this topic is both makes me want to laugh and cry at the same time. But at any rate, I do want to talk about the rule of law and on its fragility, in addition to its importance. Now, a few weeks ago, I did also mention the rule of law. This is part of, as I said, part of my morning ritual when I start planning and making notes is like not just looking for titles in the past, but like skimming my notes. I did also talk about the rule of law a couple of weeks ago in talking about what I called the court jesters standing outside the courtroom, yelling about the jurors and the judge and how the trial was unfair. I mentioned that what they were doing was, in a sense, decrying or denouncing or certainly chipping away at our respect for the rule of law, which is part of what I'm going to come to today. So we've touched on it in a variety of ways. It does. I realized when I gave today's title, whatever I ended up with the title for today, and I know it had the rule of law in the title, that title, maybe that was in the title, I don't remember. I realized the boring factor, that just seems boring. So one of the main points I'll be making today are the many ways in which this is so much, not just more lively, but vitally important and not cut and dried as it sounds. That's going to be part of what I'm addressing today. But as ever, really quickly at the outset here, I want to address definitions. right? We want to start at least by having a shared sense of what the rule of law is. Now, the basic premise of the rule of law is that no one is above the law, and that the law rules through public and legitimate laws that apply to everyone. And real democracy, like democracy with heart, like an actual democratic form of governance, needs a democratic rule of law that ensures that people have political rights, that they have certain civil liberties. And I would say, if contingency is my number one word that I say every Friday here on History Matters, accountability is probably a close runner-up. Accountability I talk about all the time because that's vitally important in a democratic form of government, that the people who we give power to are accountable for how they use that power. They're accountable ultimately to us. But the rule of law, a shared set of standards, is one way in which we hold them accountable. Now, the World Justice Project describes the rule of law as, and this is a quote, a durable system of laws, institutions, norms, and I want to actually emphasize this little phrase, norms and community commitments. So again, what I'm talking about today is not necessarily going to be cut and dried, that delivers accountability for government and individuals, just laws, open government, and accessible justice. I think last time I talked about this, I mentioned the quote that probably pops into a lot of people's minds when they're thinking about law, the importance of law, is Common Sense by Thomas Paine, or at least pops into my mind. And that just says more about me. Thomas Paine's 1776 pamphlet, Common Sense, in which he says, law is king in America. Law is king. That a king is an individual who can rule at his whim and fancy. But in America, there is a constitutionally based government that has checks and balances, and everyone has shared legal protections and safeguards. Now, as I suggested a minute ago, the rule of law, if you were to ask me some of the absolute core central components of democratic governance, I would say free and fair elections, accountability of people with power, and the rule of law. Those would be the three biggies. There are others for sure, but those would be three. And certainly the rule of law is absolutely interwoven with a functioning democracy. Under the rule of law, a democratic state elects their own leaders. The government is bound by the law. The law is respected among the citizens of the state, and the state helps with that. I'm going to come back to that because there's respect, free respect, and there's enforced respect, and I'm not talking about the latter, but I'll come back to that. Okay, but the important point, and it's been woven into what I just said when I began by tossing out definitions, is that in a sense, the power of the rule of law is self-enforcing. So you could say that there are laws, there's legislation, there's there are courts, there's police departments, there are all kinds of ways in which the rule of law can and should be and is enforced. However, in the end, and this is the theme of what I want to talk about today, the power of the rule of law depends on society, depends to a large degree on us, particularly if we're being pushed in a particular direction by people with power. So although it sounds kind of abstract, blah, 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 legal precedent, the rule of law, and all kinds of institutions and you know, cut and dried. My point here is going to be today, it also, in addition to being some of those things, relies on a shared respect for it. Shared certainly among the people who we give power to and who should be accountable to us for how they use that power and who are and should be subject to the rule of law. So their respect or disrespect for it matters. Ours does too. Ours also, our respect for the rule of law matters as well. So if we as citizens don't think about or don't respect the idea of the law applying equally to all, we will put people in office who do not respect the rule of law, who violate the rule of law, and we will help to destroy the rule of law and create a government that is governed by the whim and fancy of people with power. Now, I wanted to make a comparison here because the first thing that occurred to me when I was thinking about this topic and the fact that, and I can tell that it doesn't seem as exciting to people because I will, after I post the topic, I'll go on 100 forums of social media to see how the response is. And this response was like, yeah, okay, maybe we'll come along for this ride, which I just, again, I assume rule of law, yawn. However, let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about, in a way, feelings about the rule of law, our feelings about the rule of law and why that's important. And I'm going to make a comparison to our feelings about the Constitution, which also feels like a cut and dried document, you know, just like here's the checks and balances, here's the Constitution, it governs the nation, blah, blah, blah. But as we has always been true in American history, and certainly as we are experiencing now, questions about how it applies, when it applies, to who it applies, are ever present, and respect for it and disrespect for it can shift, particularly in the current era, disrespect for it. But let's look for a moment then at the Constitution, because as cut and dried as it seems, when the Constitution was created and when the government kicked into gear under that new Constitution, a common concern among many people who we might call framers, people who framed the Constitution, and founders, the people who were active in politics in some way in that period, they were consciously concerned about what would make a Constitution different from any other piece of legislation. They thought to themselves, and they wrote about it, you know, there are laws that are passed by legislatures, and they're important. But a Constitution, in a way, is going to feel to American citizens like just another one. Okay, some more legislation and a governing body of some kind passed it. And our country won't work if people don't respect the Constitution in a different kind of way than they respect normal legislation. People need to feel differently about the Constitution. They have to have special respect for it. They need to understand it's a special kind of document, that it really represents an important shared pact between people. I did not this morning have time to go rummage around and find quotes in which they say this. I do not think they will be hard to find because they thought about this all the time. Actually, Hamilton was an extreme thinker on this. He, as ever, was really focused on the rule of law, capital R. But he was very concerned. Why would people respect the Constitution? Why would people, in his mind, respect authority if they didn't understand that a Constitution was a different kind of document? He wrote something about credit, which is a quote that always pops into my mind, particularly applied to kind of ethereal or seemingly abstract or, all capital letter ideas that don't seem concrete. In this case, as you'll hear, he was writing about the idea of credit, right? Are you a person of credit? What does it mean to have credit, financially speaking? Credit, like what we're talking about today, the rule of law, the Constitution as a document, these are things that have immense power, and that have a concrete form, and that have another side to them that has to do with feelings and faith and trust, and a shared agreement to abide by certain standards. So Hamilton, towards the end of his time as Secretary of Treasury, he's talking about public credit. He's trying to, as he's on his way out, reinforce the reason why credit is so important, the national credit, public credit. And this is what he wrote. Credit is an entire thing. Every part of it has the nicest sympathy with every other part. Wound one limb and the whole tree shrinks and decays. He's talking about credit this is from his further report on public credit in 1795. He's talking about public credit, but that idea that credit is an entire thing, it's a whole, and that if you begin to smack at it and chip away at it, that you begin to wound it, and then the tree shrinks and decays, right? You could say the same thing about, in a way, the rule of law. You have enough people who are smacking at it or discrediting it or denouncing it, particularly, again, people with power, and it begins to shrink and decay. I said at the outset, if we, the public, don't value the rule of law and don't hold people accountable for their violation of it, it withers. This is one of many ways in which, I think, in ways that most Americans underestimate, we have so much power as the public, as the populace, in our form of government, in our democratic constitutional form of government. It ultimately rests on us. It doesn't feel like that very often, and there are a lot of people in power who don't seem to remember that very often. But the fact of the matter is, we do, at least right now, have the power, the most power and the balance of power in our government. We do still give people power, take it away from people. We can turn our back on something and denounce it. We can speak out against it. What we say, if we say it loudly and in large numbers, can actually matter. Our opinion, public opinion, as a power, as a strength, very early on, was seen and talked about. Again, this is one of the wonderful sort of deliberate things about the founding era that I love, is that they talk about all of these abstract ideas very concretely. They talked about public opinion all the time. What is it? Who's the public? How do we get it? We all know public opinion is the essence, is at the core of the authority of our government. What does that mean? And they talk about that all the time in the 1790s. So what I'm saying about the rule of law, in a way, falls into the same category as these other things. It's concrete. It's a fact. It can be backed up by legislation and constitutional dictates. And it relies on our agreement, our shared agreement to abide by it on some way, in some level, in some way, on some level. That's what I was aiming for. I'm not saying we have to all agree. I'm not saying that there needs to be sort of lockstep agreement on this, but the general idea that our Constitution is our governing document, the general idea that there should be laws that apply to us all, those are general ideas, shared ideas that we should all abide by. America has been patchy in its way of applying to that over its history, but that doesn't mean that the standard doesn't matter. It means we have to be better at interpreting and enforcing the idea that that kind of authority is shared, that we have the power, and that if people are deploying it unfairly, based on whatever, based on race or whatever, that is violating the shared standard of the rule of law, and something has to be done about it. Now, related to that point, I feel like it's important for me to say, when I talk about the rule of law, it's easy to go too far with that sentiment and to assume that I'm talking about blind obedience to the rule of law. And that is not what I am saying. I am not talking about strict enforcement of the rule of law and that we all march in lockstep or fear violating the laws. I'm not talking about that. What I am talking about is just a shared agreement as a starting point. The shared idea that the law applies to all of us. And that's vital, because if that's being violated, if we see law being deployed in a racist way, it's that standard that we can use to oppose that, to change that. At its heart, the rule of law relies on a shared agreement of its importance and of its presence as a shared standard that we don't always live up to, but we should. And its blatant violation without accountability is a problem. So kind of like I consider often the Constitution as a shared pact that we agree to abide by, and we disagree on what it means and we disagree on how it applies. But generally speaking, the idea that our Constitution is the essence of our government, we should share that idea, right? That's kind of the essence of who we are. The rule of law I put in a similar category. Just the general idea that the rule applies to all of us equally, or that it should, is important. The fact that it doesn't is important too, but that's why the standard is important, because we have something to hold violators accountable for. Oh, you know what? You're really racist in your application of the law. Guess what? That's not the idea behind the rule of law. The rule of law is supposed to apply to all of us equally. Same thing, there's a similar way of understanding the preamble in the Declaration of Independence, which talks about lofty things, equality and rights and the pursuit of happiness. And you can certainly point to that and say, well, there was a limited group of white men who that applied to when that document was written. There was no assumption on the part of the people who wrote that document that those ideas would apply to everyone equally. However, the existence of those ideas, putting them in print and having that be a national shared document, that became a vital tool for people to use further in time, later 18th and particularly the 19th century, to point to those shared standards. And their shared standards are on our Declaration of Independence, a founding document. And they could say, see those standards there in the Declaration of Independence? You're not meeting them. You're not applying them to us, and we deserve to live by those shared standards. And I suppose in some ways, I'm talking about the rule of law in a similar way. It relies on credibility and faith, a shared sense of its power, close watching of how it's being applied, a willingness to speak up when we feel that it's being violated, a watching closely. And I don't know how many, if I went back and looked at all of our 219 episodes to see how often I say watch closely, it would be a lot of times. But that idea applies here, that we need to watch and think about how things are or are not being applied. The rule of law in the current case, and a former president of the United States is at the top of the list, but also how people are treating the rule of law or talking about the rule of law or disrespecting the rule of law. Just the simple idea that the law applies to all of us equally, or at least it should. The should is really important. Without the should, we're just victims of circumstance. With that should, that shared should, we have the power of change. So I suppose, again, I'm talking to so many teachers here. That's part of what we need to teach students. It's just that we share the Constitution, and we share an understanding that the rule should apply to all of us equally. We share those things, and they're important things that we share. And once you have that understanding, then you can evaluate what you're seeing around you, decide how it does or doesn't fit within that belief system. As a democratic nation, a democratic republic, we, the people, different document, Constitution, we, the people, what we feel really does matter. And that's even true about seemingly cut and dry documents like the Constitution, and seemingly cut and dry dictates like the rule of law. Thus, my statement at the beginning that what I'm talking about is not some boring bunch of legislation. It's the simple idea that the law should apply to all of us in the same way, and that if it doesn't, the idea of the rule of law gives us the power to stand up and protest and to talk about what we deserve. Okay. I am 3 minutes early, but I'm gonna stop there and move my notes. Okay, mug. So if there are people here who do not normally come, if they're first timers or not very often timers, for 219 weeks, I have a mug that I bring that relates to the theme of what we're talking about. You're gonna have to travel with me a little bit on this one because it applies, but only if you travel with me a little bit on this one. So if what I was just talking about was our feelings about the rule of law, our sentiment about it, really like our personal way of understanding and feeling that the rule of law applies to us all. So the best that I could come up with today was a mug that is all about feelings. It's a Carolee mug. Oh, It's in honor of Newbie the history bird from when he died, Newbie Freeman. And it said, I'll read it. It says, award-winning, wise, fun, humorous, sweet, brave, feisty, loving, and thoughtful history bird, passionately and tirelessly peeping and oodling for democracy. Rest in peace, sweet friend. Carolee, this is like one of the nicer things in the universe, although you always are doing nicest things in the universe. But it couldn't be more about feelings. It also has, I'll show you the other side. It also has some wonderful newbie pictures and a sort of photo from the other side. Anyway, so that I'm talking about feelings and personal sentiment, and that felt to me like you might travel along with me in believing that that's related to what we're talking about. I think it is. I think it is. Because it gets down to
a mug that just said should.
Should.
Yep, that's a great mug.
I love this mug. Okay.
Right, we have got questions. Oh, Gloria's back. Gloria, we haven't seen you in a while.
I'm going to open the chat so I can see everyone's question.
Okay, so Gloria asks, how do you distinguish a show trial from the rule of law? Is not innocent until proven guilty part of the rule of law?
Yes, you should be innocent until proven guilty. That is true. And I mean, I am assuming that there might be recent events that is applying to. I think, well, I won't be specific here. I will say yes, part of the rule of law is that the law should be applied to everyone equally. Part of the rule of law is that you are innocent until proven guilty. You deserve a fair trial if you go to court, often by a jury of your peers. Yes, all of those things are part of the rule of law. I think part of what we're seeing in this current moment is people having a political response to the idea of the rule of law. And by that, I mean the application of the rule of law appears to some people to be highly partisan. And they're saying that the Department of Justice or the president, for example, are somehow causing or shaping or masterminding, for example, former President Trump's recent trial, that somehow or other they're political events. You know, I point to the rule of law as a way of countering that argument. There were 12 jurors. Both sides had to agree to those 12 jurors. So the 12 people sitting there, everyone said, okay, thumbs up. And the process that went on in that courtroom was the normal process in a court of law, right? So if you want to talk about not liking the outcome or the verdict, the rule of law, you can appeal. And it's totally possible that on appeal, something will come out that people feel was not correct about that trial, and that's perfectly valid. That's why you're allowed to appeal, right? Is that sometimes you appeal and you're correct, sometimes you appeal and you're not correct. So, you know, I think that's part of what's underlying this question. There can be show trials, but show trials would have a stacked jury, for example, which is not what we saw here. Show trials would have no credible charges of any kind behind them at all, right? There are thousands of pages of evidence in the case of former President Trump's trial. There are ways in which we could define a show trial. It's an interesting idea. It might, I always say, let's talk about it more next week. And then I end up coming up with a different topic. And we answer, like from last week, we had questions left over, but when I went and looked at them, we had answered a lot of them. So there were only one or two left. This is another case in which it would be really interesting. And if I can remember it, I will try to tend to it. There are such things as show trials, but a court case, a trial, which abides by the standards of how the rule of law operates, of how court trials, fair trials operate. If you don't like the outcome, it isn't necessarily a show trial. And as with everything I'm talking about today that sounds cut and dried and sounds as though, you know, it's all on pieces of paper, one of my points today is that nothing is ever that simple. And we are talking about shared standards and we are talking about public opinion. But I think there is a difference between something that's really obviously a show trial and something that's based on credible evidence deploying the rules of a credible court of law.
Yeah, in the chat, somebody mentioned that they actually work in the courthouse and that they felt like watching, the daily reports from the case, that they did a good job managing and following the protocols. I think that from what I observed, I've mainly read it. I can't stand to watch it on TV anymore. Just, it's just too much. I'm just going to read it and it's less despairing, but it seemed like they were being extra careful so that there would be less chance to get it off on a technicality. So, which kind of leads us to Sydney's question. Sydney's grappling with why it seems like some people seem to be above the law and get away with things over and over again, and the law can't touch them, when other people seem to have the law against them and have no power in the legal system. So how does that keep happening? She's wondering.
And it has happened forever. It is true. That's a really valid point. It has happened forever. It has happened because there are, and it has long been the case, that the people with the most power in our society tend to be white men. That's not a radical statement. That's a fact. And if that's the fact, and if some of those people want to keep things that way, you don't want change to happen really very much. So it happens again and again because we have people in power who do not necessarily have our shared standard that the rule of law applies to us all equally. Again, this is when the standard part of that phrase, the fact that the standard of the rule of law matters. We can see this happening. We know it's happening. We have the awareness, the shared standard that shows it's being violated. The question is, how do we respond to that? And the ways in which we can respond to that change over time. And there are a number of different ways. And sometimes with some kinds of government, you're freer to talk about that and oppose that and make a point than you are with other kinds of governments. And this is part of why our current moment is important, because there are some governments, some kinds of government in which you're not going to be allowed to speak against people with power, in which you're not going to be allowed to say this is unfair or I deserve equal respect under the law. You're just not going to be allowed to say that. The people in power will have power, and that will be unquestioned. If people believe that they have unquestioned power and that it applies, that basically what they think and want applies, generally speaking, the rule of law is not in operation there. So our awareness of this shared standard matters, partly because we can see it being violated, but that doesn't mean we surrender and say it has always been bad and it always will be bad. I think sometimes there are some people on the left who veer in that direction. We've never had democracy. We never will. So why are we fighting for it? I've had people actually respond when I talk about democracy. There's some on the left who have said, we've never had it anyway, so whatever. And we've certainly not reached an ideal form of democratic governance, but I don't think the response to that is, oh, well, it can't work. I think the response to that is, we have this shared standard. If you're speaking up and saying we've never had it, you understand on a basic level what it is and what we should have. And those are the two starting points of working for something better. So I don't think you surrender when you think things are unfair. I think you find ways that are powerful in the time that you're in, and you speak up and speak out and act against the unfairness.
So Dave has a question. He says, if no one is above the law, why would SCOTUS take up a case regarding presidential immunity? At what point could citizens just ignore SCOTUS decisions the way the South did after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments?
Right. Well, this is, there are many people who would say that there should be no case about presidential immunity for this very reason, right? Really? You're going to make a case that the president of the United States can do anything and commit crimes in some way or another and then will be immune from prosecution for them? That was not a shared standard when our founding documents were created. That is not a shared standard under however you define the rule of law. It isn't. The idea that a president is a special person who is above the law, period. We shouldn't be talking about that because makes no sense. And which is why when I talked on an earlier occasion about the amicus brief that I signed onto about this question, if you read it, and I said then, and I'll say it again, it's easy to find online from the Brennan Center for Justice. It's written really clearly in a really straightforward manner. And what it says again and again and again is, if you know anything about the founding period, it makes absolutely no sense to talk about presidential immunity. Zippo, none. There's nothing there to ground it on. And it violates in some key ways, really, what our government stands for. So you're right. We shouldn't be talking about it. It shouldn't be up for the Supreme Court to decide, because there was already a lower court that drew an opinion on it. The Supreme Court decided, yeah, we'll consider it. They didn't have to. They didn't have to take this up. It shouldn't be a question. It really shouldn't. It's kind of there, in the Constitution, and what isn't in the Constitution matters too. So anyway, we shouldn't be talking about it is my short answer to that question, because it makes no sense to talk about it. And the fact that we are discussing it and its viability should be frightening, because it should not be the case. No president should have that kind of total immunity.
All right, Kathy Porter asks, the misuse of money in politics and in courting judges seems to also be a factor in diminishing the impact of the rule of law. Jane Mayer posted about dark money involved in masking decisions. I think she said the Koch brothers were behind that. Can we ever get the dark money problems back in the bottle?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. I certainly think dark money and light money, right? Just money. And its role in politics, its blatant role in politics and injustice. And in injustice is another thing that we're certainly having paraded before our view these days. I don't know the answer to the question of, can we put it back in the bottle? It might be a different conversation, but for example, what if you actually had ethics standards for Supreme Court justices, for example? So that there were things that they shouldn't. I see that someone said there are a lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts. Here's another one. Things you shouldn't do. Now, an ethics standard, kind of like what I'm talking about today in a way, but to a more extreme degree, only applies if people give it credence, give it credibility, and say, yes, I will abide by this ethics standard. They might say, no, I would like to be given $4 million for my job outside of it by rich, important people. But an ethics code would enable other people to say, yeah, okay, well, you just said that, and actually you are very specifically violating a code that one would assume Supreme Court justices, for example, might sign on to when they take their office. It's not a hammer saying, boom, you're out. But the presence of a shared agreement on what should or shouldn't be happening versus a vague norm, which is what we have now, like, that's not right. That's wrong. That shouldn't be happening. That's clearly wrong. And here we are. I don't think ethics standards are immensely powerful, but I think their existence draws lines. And as I've talked about before, when talking about hearings, why hearings are important regardless of the outcome, because a hearing is a line drawing exercise, right? If there was a hearing about what's going on in the Supreme Court right now, as far as outside money, if there were a hearing or about upside down flags or whatever else, if there was a hearing about the way in which current Supreme Court justices are behaving, regardless of the outcome of the hearing, what Congress would be saying in one way or another was, this crosses a line, not acceptable. And maybe they won't be able to say, like, ooh, we're going to punish you. But the simple fact of the government saying this is wrong, I think that matters. I think drawing that line matters. And in a way, even more importantly, I think not drawing that line matters. If all of this is going on and no one steps up and says in a concrete way, this is wrong, we're going to talk about why this is wrong in a formal space with a hearing. If you don't do that, you're basically just giving it credibility and allowing it to go on by. So I think I had similar conversations when people would ask me about the January 6th hearings. Why are they important? What's going to happen? Or were they important if nothing happens? Yeah, I think, and you can go and find, I wrote about this a couple of different places. I'm not going to remember where, maybe Atlantic or the New York Times. And when Heather and I had our podcast Now and Then, we did an episode on this as well, why hearings are important, because they draw lines, because they are the government saying a line has been crossed. And we need to have those kinds of declarations for those lines to exist. So I think for that reason, regardless of outcome, I mean, ideally you want an outcome, but even regardless of outcome, it's important, I think, to have hearings for that reason. And again, that in a sense, that's part of the general idea of what stands behind the rule of law, right? That we have a shared standard in some way of what's right and what's wrong, and we need to stand up and speak about that and act in its favor when we feel it is being violated.
All right. Dave asks, how do you square rule of law and speedy trial and respect of judges with what Judge Cannon did with the documents case in Florida? The paperless orders are now to me making a mockery of justice for all.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a great case in which a judge has decided to delay who knows how long the case of these confidential documents that Donald Trump had in his possession that were not his, no matter how many times he says it, they were not. But here we go. So here's the opposite side of like, yippee, the rule of law. A judge has declared this. You can have judges that make rulings that you do not like. You can have court trials that end up, obviously coming to a conclusion that you really do not like and that you think is unfair. Again, this is why appeals are important. In the current case, we can't simply say, to heck with this judge, we're going to do something else. We have to work through the system and do what we can do or what we can't do. It's the counter side, right, of a shared pact or a shared standard. The system supposedly has within it ways in which we can fight back, ways in which we can protest. And no matter what side you're on, if you go beyond that system and say, I don't care about judges and I don't care, throw her out, let's get another one. That's not a good path to go down, because you don't want anyone to be able to do that. Even if you think you have valid reasons to do it now, you don't want somebody else to do that down the pike. So it's an example of, I'm not saying that there isn't a way to address this, but at the moment, she's a judge who made this decision. I think it's a bad and obviously political decision, partisan. But I think people who know far more than I do about our legal system need to think about how to address that, if that can be addressed. And certainly people need to be pointing out loudly and frequently what it means, what's being hidden or avoided, what we're being told not to think about and not to talk about before the election.
All right, we've got one of those what do you think kind of questions. Emma's wondering, what about SCOTUS? It seems like Justices Alito, Thomas, and the rest are rewriting laws or ignoring them, or norms that have been around for decades. And I'm going to combine that with Catherine's asking, do you think they'll take on the Trump conviction? Will that go up to the Supreme Court?
In the latter case, I have no idea. I mean, I say this very often. I'm contingency. We're in such a moment of extreme contingency that I hesitate to make predictions of any kind, because I'm kind of surprised all the time and not surprised all the time, right? Something will happen and I'll be like, that really happened? And then I'll immediately think, yeah, of course that. Like, we're in this current time. So thank you, Tim. Contingency. So I won't predict about what the heck can happen. But what was the first half of the question before we got to, will the Supreme Court?
Yeah, it just seems like so many of them are just rewriting laws or ignoring rules and norms that have been around for decades. So she's wondering, how does that fit in with the rule of law when our highest, judging pool is
right. And so a couple of things. First, I want to talk about norms. I thought about for a while, Naming this episode, I decided not to, but down the road, there might be an episode titled Norm with an exclamation point, and those who know Cheers would know what I'm talking about. And I've mentioned this, I know before, it was striking to me at a very early point. And I say this as a political historian who has been teaching about politics and the Constitution and every other sort of trapping of politics for a really long time at this point. I hadn't, in my gut, absorbed the degree to which we are governed by norms. I could say that to you abstractly. When I would teach the Constitution, I would say it's an outline of a government. It's very short considering what it does. And there was an assumption that everything around it would be filled in practice, and that there'd be precedents set and norms established, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what we have been seeing in recent years, and really beginning in an extreme way, I think, during the Trump presidency, is just norms, some really important ones, some really unimportant ones, but still significant in some way, just being violated. And then there's a sort of, particularly early on, there would be a sort of, can we stop that? No, we can't. Actually, it's not a law, right? It's just what we assume people would do. Like, oh, I don't know, accept the outcome of an election. But like a little tiny one that I remember noticing and thinking it doesn't seem to mean anything except in the spirit of everything that's happening. It gave me pause. Early on, very early on in his presidency, Donald Trump would get on Air Force One and wouldn't turn around and wave to the cameras. He would just get on the plane. And I remember noticing that and thinking, sort of ideologically speaking, he's not even acknowledging us, right? The point of that ritual, the point of doing that sort of symbolic gesture is, hello, nation, I'm being your president, getting on the plane, right? There's a sort of meaning in that. And we're so used to seeing that when I didn't see it, I was like, what? Wait, aren't we supposed to? And then I thought, well, that actually, it's a norm that I didn't ever question. And it actually kind of has a meaning to it. So we've been seeing norms violated left and right, and left and right, we've been seeing the reality of that there isn't a law. There have been assumptions that this is the way it works and this is the way it should work. And people abide by the outcomes of free and fair elections. If they don't like them, they use the process in place to challenge them, and then they abide by the outcome of that process as well. So norms are being violated all the time. We live in that moment. But now you're going to have to get me back, Annie, because I now veered off down a different rabbit hole. We got norms. Where was I headed with norms?
Wondering, with these justices seemingly ignoring them, like how should we expect everyone else to obey the rule of law when our highest, officials in the judicial system are ignoring it?
Right. So in this case, and I would encourage you to go find a series of recent articles that I've noticed and haven't yet had the time to stop and read, but their point is really obvious, on social media, but in print. A number of justices have been coming forward and talking about how they have always believed the Supreme Court should operate and how they think it's operating now. Now, I say that without suggesting that the Supreme Court has always been above all partisanship and just abiding by ideal universal standards. It hasn't. It's a political institution in the sense that politicians are part of how they get there, and that they have political beliefs, right? And we can all point to Supreme Court decisions that have been really obviously both partisan and biased against some Americans. But I think our understanding of the Supreme Court, the credibility of the Supreme Court, the meaning of the Supreme Court in this moment is really being challenged. And so not only do we have the Supreme Court making rulings about things that we've assumed were shared standards, but as everything, as is happening with everything in this era, there's a blatant, proud kind of belligerence about, yeah, I'm doing it. So what? That's a problem, right? So it's one thing to do these things and kind of not acknowledge them. That's not good, right? So I'm not saying that that's positive, but if you know you're behaving incorrectly, if you know you are coming up with rulings that are violating absolute, actually, Sonia Sotomayor had a statement. She spoke, I think, at a graduation ceremony, talking about how sometimes she leaves decisions and cries. Go find that. She talks about how some decisions have made her cry because she can see the direction that things are going and it's not how things are going. Or I wish I had the name of the justice who just, not a Supreme Court justice, but a legal authority who just said, I always understood the Supreme Court to be, I had faith that it would be at least, at the very least, this kind of institution, and our current Supreme Court is not even abiding by that standard. I can't, as ever, I can't predict what the heck is going to happen with the Supreme Court. I do know that it can, right now, under our system, make these kinds of rulings in a way that's an advertisement for the vital importance of every other aspect of our constitutional government, right? So the Supreme Court, they're there, for life during good behavior, but they're put there by presidents. They are approved by Congress. They're, all of the ways in which we might tend to focus on presidents and now the Supreme Court. We shouldn't forget that every other aspect of government, national, local, and otherwise, feeds into, excuse me, the system that ends up there. So this is a roundabout way of my saying, what do they call it? Down ballot. Remember what's going on now when you vote for any office, to give anyone power, because you are giving power to people who will abide by or share sympathies with or support different views of what our government should or shouldn't do. And if you're looking at the Supreme Court right now and thinking they're proudly, blatantly partisan to such an extreme degree that they clearly, they feel they have no accountability at all. Well, think about what I think the Republicans did for a long time in a very effective way. Think about who you're giving office to, right? The Republicans for a long time have been thinking about who gets into the Supreme Court and who their justices are and who gets judgeships. For this very moment, everyone needs to think that way for this reason. So I don't know where we're going to land. We're in a really, let's just say, interesting moment in the history of the Supreme Court, not because it's partisan for the first time, but as I said a moment ago, because of the attitude towards being partisan and the absolute blatant love of having no accountability. That's the sort of blatant love of breaking the law without accountability, the many ways in which people right now are violating a variety of norms and standards and are really proud of themselves when they do and they don't get held accountable. That's not necessarily unique, but that's like a brand of what's going on right now. There's a pride to unacceptable behavior and undemocratic thoughts and ideas, a pride that people have because they can get away with it, because they're not being held accountable, which gets back to the statement I make all the time about why accountability is so important to democratic governance.
Yeah. Okay, Ellen, we only have 3 minutes. Ellen wanted to know if you had, excuse me, not Ellen, Dave, if you had thoughts on Marbury versus Madison, where SCOTUS basically gave themselves power that were in the Constitution, and he's wondering if the Congress or executive branch, if there's anything that they could rein in SCOTUS using Marbury versus Madison being outside the law. Is it too late, or has that just been around for so long?
Oh, wow. I don't know if you can like act out against.
Like, hey, you know what you did like a couple hundred years ago? Bam, that was never the Constitution, so we're throwing that one out.
What was interesting, one of the ideas up for debate early on, people always referred to, in that early period, they referred to the Supreme Court as the weakest branch, because you had the power of the purse with Congress, you had the power of armed force with the executive, and the Supreme Court was just about, sort of judging and ruling, and it was not seen as something that was as powerful as the other branches. That law case changed the power of the court in a radical way. But should there be a way for the Supreme Court to judge cases and judge their credibility and judge their legality and judge whether they should be enforced? It's a big question as to whether we should have that at all. To me, I think it would be a huge thing to say that the Supreme Court shouldn't have the power of judicial review over laws. On the other hand, I think what we're seeing is an outcome of partisan judicial review, as I said before, to an extreme degree. I don't have the answer to that question. But what's interesting is to acknowledge the fact that at the beginning, the Supreme Court was seen as the weakest branch. It just didn't have any power. It was just there to kind of grant credibility and make rulings, but not in the way that now and before, it's fundamentally shaped American society, shaped our lives, our everyday lives in really extreme ways.
All right, we are right up on the 11 o'clock hour, but we have 5 more questions. Do you want to try and squeeze a couple?
Is there one that seems like I could answer in a couple of minutes?
This one's pretty cool because it's a Hamilton. We know how much you love Hamilton questions. This is from Bailey Paletti. Hi, Bailey. Your discussion of Hamilton's use of credit as a metaphor for the rule of law reminds me of MLK's promissory note metaphor from his I Have a Dream speech, arguing that segregationism, in addition to everything else wrong, corroded public trust in the rule of law. Can you think of another instance in history where credit or that kind of a metaphor was used and how effective it was towards the audience?
Oh, interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't, certainly not, as you're suggesting, it's not unique to Hamilton. He's not the first person who talked about credit in this way, though. He thought about credit and reputation a lot, which is another way of thinking about credit. I would be stunned if there weren't other incidents in history where people use that metaphor. There was I haven't looked at this in like 30 years, but I remember there was a really interesting article on the meaning of credit to people using that idea in I think the American Historical Review. I'm not going to be able to call the site in my head, but I cite it in my first book. I think in the chapter on dueling, in my footnotes, and it's about the idea of credit and reputation and how those things are bound together, and all the different ways in which they've been used, sometimes financially and sometimes in other ways as well. I don't think that article goes through all of time, all of history in all countries to do that, but it would offer a key, like an index, to think about other ways in which people use that metaphor. It's a really good question, and it's a really powerful, it's powerful because in a sense, the reality of that, of money or not enough money touches all of us, right? Credit, being able to have the credit, the money, the power to do something, or not being credited or having no credit is something that you get in your gut, which is part of why Hamilton said what he said. That's a really good question.
And if we can squeeze one more in, and maybe
Okay.
even Tim could help with this in the chat.
Okay.
Robert Hirsch wanted to know, he says, societies moved farther away from agrarian economics. The meaning of words and philosophies used at the time of the founding has morphed. He's wondering if you could recommend a book that is available that delves into that phenomenon. So maybe if you, Joanne, or even some of our librarians.
Meaning of words over time and how they've changed.
Words over time, yeah. And he specified agrarian economics at the founding era.
Let me think about that one. There's an interesting book, but it's a different topic, but it is about how people use words. There's an interesting book about the ways in which people speak politically. It's not related to this topic, but it's called Democratic Eloquence. It's by Kenneth Camiel, C-M-I-E-L, I think. And it just talks about Lincoln's style of speaking and writing and that how that was so dramatically different from what came before, but it's not addressing this idea. So the ways in which words are used, I mean, what I would think is that if you're looking at specific words and you're looking at you look up articles, you're going to find that all over the place, right? So whatever, pick a word and there will be people who have analyzed its usage over time. But as far as a book that does that in a broad kind of a way. Right now, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's not popping into my head.
I just put a link in. I think I've mentioned this before, the PACE language study that they did a few years ago, and they just updated it, where they pulled people from both ends of the political spectrum, from different walks of life, different socioeconomic statuses, race, religion, gender, and asked, how do you feel about this word, democracy or civics, and they just redid it so you can compare it like 3 years ago to now.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And it's
I
a
will,
really cool data visualization. So I just put that in the chat too for you.
I also, related to that, Deb says the word liberal has a different meaning. Yeah, and so does conservative. You know,
Those are
the first lecture of my American Revolution course, History 116, I think if you look at Open Yale courses, American Revolution, you'll find it. The beginning of the first lecture, I think it's like Freeman's top 10 tips for studying the American Revolution. And one of them is words have different meanings. And I talk about democracy and what it means. And, you know, absolutely, it's vitally important. And, oh, look at that. Of course, Tim, there's democratic.
yeah.
So of course, it does touch on a point, though, that I've said a lot about modern politics, and that holds true forever. And that is to look at the words, think about the words that are being used, you know, look if they're making you feel emotional, why? What are the specific words? What are people saying with the specific words that they're choosing? Because they choose them. And sometimes that choice can really have a lot of meaning. Okay, now we're 5 minutes over, so I should shut up. Okay. So let me explain where we are going. We are now going to have the after party. What that means is that if you joined us through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. In the after party, we no longer record, so we can say whatever we want and be even freer and easier than we normally are. I remember once I said, in the after party, we turn off the camera. I was like, and we just sit here staring at the black screen. It's like, no, that's not what we do. We no longer record. That's right. We no longer record. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. I want to thank everyone for engaging in the ongoing conversation of democracy, during which just the fact that we're having this conversation is establishing a really important norm. We have the right to do this. We should be doing this. Everyone should be having these kinds of conversations because that's what empowers democracy, because that's what gives us an understanding of our power. I want to thank Annie. I want to thank Sabo the Avocado Claire. I want to thank Jessica, John, and NCHE as ever for being here and making this possible, our ongoing tradition, for doing our best to stand behind democracy and push forward. I'm just so proud of us. I know I say that endlessly, but what a thing, right? What a thing. I'll end on that blindingly obvious point. What a thing. And we can segue to the after party.